public hearing for ZC 2016-01 noise regulation to order. And we have our zoning commission here, and who is going to speak on behalf of
Todd and
Todd?
Edward.
Hey guys.
have the floor.
All right. So this is something that we spent some time on trying to really tackle the issue because of in the current zoning standard it was a max decimal level. So essentially, if you went out there and made fired up your lawnmower right at your property line, you probably would exceed it right away. And we realized that's not the best way, and that's not what I think overall intention was. So we reviewed what we believe the intention was. And it really came down to two things, because in this section, it is in the business area, and it talks about the adjacent property to residential. So it's not a residential, it's business to residential, or non-residential business side. So we talked about what we felt we needed from a homeowner perspective, residential side, what they should expect as they have a property or buying into a property, and also from a commercial side as they came in and what they needed from, I want to operate a business, what do I know that I need to meet from a zoning side. So we tried to look at both ends of that so that we could make it both commercially available for people to come in, know what to expect, and residentials to feel that they can have quiet time in the nighttime, outside what we call normal business hours. So the first thing we tackled was just taking away the maximum. We got into a lot of different areas of that, and we ended up with thinking the best approach would be to go to an average. So the terminology changed to an average, and I'll just step down through it. The other thing we did was expanded the hours. So again, as we went to an average approach, we started talking through what are the correct hours of where people would want to run normal operations of business that allow a little bit more noise. You can think of summer hours kind of thing. And so we expanded the hours and for the daytime use, and then also decreased, obviously, for the nighttime use. And again, the next and the further section down. So in the next section, we talked about how are we going to determine the average. And there's all kinds of calculated means. There's a lot of companies that do this. They take averages over long periods of time. We got into different scenarios where what happens is somebody's making noise for 4 hours or 6 hours, but the last hour they quit. How do we want to handle those conditions? So we put some thought into that, and we figured the best approach was to go for it, take the average of the highest 8 hours over that time period. That gave us flexibility in the changing the hours and discussing them separately. So we figured we'd look over an 8-hour period. So if our range is 12 hours, so 6 to 9 p.m., we're actually talking about 9 hours. The highest 8 hours of that is what we'll use. That gave us, again, we took away the equation, we want to look over 8 hours. We take the average of those, and then we figure out what the noise level is, and then if you exceed it, then you're in violation of that. The last change was in that measurement part 3, we didn't want to go to lot line of the property from which the sound originates, but just from the point along the property line. So you'd have a determination when this was going to be measured from that property line where it would be taken. We just felt it was a little wordy in that. I would like to switch to my computer real quick, and I'll show you why we felt that averaging was the best approach. So if you look here, what this works out is you have 16 hours, and what I did here is I took the first 8 hours and made them extremely high noise. And then I just, in the last 8 hours, I made them much lower noise level. And you can see if you just look at the top 8 hours, you have a much higher dB average. If you look at the last 8 hours, so you can drop that considerably. If you look at the middle hours, you have a high one, and the sum of all is still high. So again, we're trying to make that even. If you're wondering about the calculations, they're all on this side. I can get in those more. Sorry. And then the next thing I did was took more of a reasonable approach. And this is where I would think of being a more reasonable approach, where you have some elevated noise through the first 8 hours. Took the sum of the top 8 hours, you were sitting at 68 dB, so obviously that'd be past the point that we felt was fair. You take the last 8 hours, you're at 59, the middle here, and then the sum of all. But you can see, again, you can see a large fluctuation between these, and this all just comes down to what numbers I plugged in. So I can change the sound levels. Throughout there, I just put in random numbers, so there's no real choice of numbers. But that was sort of just an idea that gives you that these numbers can really change based on how many hours you put in there and how you go about it. But that's why we wanted to go with the top hours. Because again, what we are looking for, I think the biggest key was, something that's repetitive happening all the time. If somebody goes out and sets up a trailer or has to, got some machine broke down at night and repair it one night, they move on. But if somebody's out there every night banging away at noise, that's what we're trying to prevent from. So again, that's how the averages came about. Felt that was the right changes. And I think that pretty much covers Albert.
Yeah, for example, during this time that he was speaking, his peak noise level was about 72 decibels. I've got this little app over here, and I do a lot of work doing industrial hygiene on the side. So measuring noise for businesses, especially if you're permitting a new factory somewhere, you have all of these standards for measuring. If you're working in the factory, that's something different. You have noise levels to protect you from hearing loss. We're talking about the difference between sounds and nuisance noise. And nuisance noise is something that's continuous and gets grading over time. And that's one thing that a lot of people, when they move into the countryside, they don't realize that the countryside is noisy. If you look at the average decibel range on a normal country road, you're somewhere around 50, 60 decibels constantly. But you don't notice it after a while because it's in the background for you. If you have a farmer near you that's plowing and stuff like that, you're somewhere around 72 to 75 decibels during the time he's plowing. And if you're hunters and stuff like that, that's a different type of noise. That's impact noise. And a shot is actually quite harmful to your health in that instantaneous moment if you don't have ear protection. But how many of you go shooting without ear protection? A lot of people do. And so this is why we have to differentiate between nuisance noise and just sounds. He's got a chart over there with different types of sound levels.
Well, that I can bring that up too.
And this is the propagation of the sound pressure.
So this has a bunch of different sounds. This is where the critical alert is around above 80. Again, exposure to that sound of higher levels will damage hearing. The other interesting thing is, so we have less church of this stuff is, remember we're measuring at the property line. I mean, as sound travels, so as that power of that source starts to go out, it does start to dissipate. So it's not like if you're standing there and you hear something, where it's emanating from will be, but as you move out, it's 1/4 at twice the radius. So that's the other function of this. So we know as you move out to somebody's property line, again, if you're performing some kind of work right at the edge, you're going to have a higher noise impact to that neighbor than you would if you're in the middle of your property and that kind of stuff. So again, that's why I think the other thing that I guess I'll briefly cover, because to try to preempt any any different questions is, we did review what's the right way, should we go by and effectively tell exactly how to calculate the noise and the averages. There are lots of different ways. There are many handheld type devices besides phones, but like professional equipment that people have that aren't expensive, easy to calibrate, that can be used. They have built in, some take them at every 10 milliseconds, some take them at every 100 milliseconds. They do all the computational for that. The biggest thing comes down to what kind of curves you can use. A lot of them will do all curves, and what they talk about curve level is, for a human, we hear at different frequencies, so a low bass sound has a much higher, potentially, or high frequency has a much more impact on our ears than a low bass. So that's where we're saying different noise tend to affect us differently. And they have curves that get applied so that it more effectively relates to a person, that can be applied to those. And essentially what it means is, if you have a noise level, they actually knock it down a little if you want to put a particular curve on. And there's a lot of discussions around, should you use the A, B, or C curve. You can use them all. A lot of the numbers work out together. So we decided, if this does come up and needs to go out, either have a company or have purchase equipment, if somebody does come forward with this, that's where the determination should be made of what we want to go. We don't want to regulate, because these could change over time, and now all of a sudden we're dictating what that should be. The other thing I just show over here is, this is probably, so just to give you an idea, this is essentially what happens. These are those A, B, and C curves, and you can see this is the original line, and they attenuate that signal down based on those curves. And again, it's taken into account noise for what human consumption is. And the last thing I'll show is, but that's important to remember. This is just general attenuation level of that sound. So as you move away from that noise source, that it drops considerably. And again, it's sort of a graphical approach of at 0, 0. So if you have a high level noise, you get no attenuation. But as you move away, this is in meters, but at 10 meters, you've essentially knocked that noise level down to minus 20. So if the noise was 100 dB at 10 meters away, you're sitting at 80. That's about what you hear. It's a general curve. I mean, it's not specific. There could be trees in the way and other things in the way that would change that, but in open air space, that's about what you're going to get. So again, we worked through and put all that together, and that's where we felt the best way and most flexible way for the township is to have an average across this, instead of getting into a lot more wording and directing things. There's multiple approaches. So.
Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Did you go through the implementation of this? I have a noise problem. I call Frank Kitco.
Mm-hmm.
What is Frank supposed to do?
So,
and how do I know, when I call Frank and I say, Frank, PJ's making all kinds of noise.
Always.
Okay, and I want you to do something about it. What is the chain of events that Frank has to do under this to make it happen? Make whatever happen. Yes, it's good. No, it's not good. I'm asking this a little bit on behalf of Frank.
Wouldn't this be like any other complaint that comes to Frank, whether it be noise or anything else that he has to go out on? Wouldn't it be?
Well, if my complaint is that PJ built his house too close to mine, it's pretty simple to answer that question.
Tape measure.
Tape measure.
I'm not like.
This I want to know from you guys, what is the procedure that Frank is going to use to implement this?
So I
this
guess
ordinance?
to us, and we did talk about it quite a bit, and
Mhm.
we felt there was two approaches. And the one is, just like he goes out and purchases a tape measure, he can go out and purchase a sound meter, set it up to take the measurements himself, run it through, set it up on the property line where he feels best is, and let it run, collect the data. And again, a lot of these tools that are available have built-in functions for this. So it's not like, as you go through this, it's going to be a difficult thing to say.
Okay, so Frank goes out there, he does that, and he determines that it's 5 decibels above what you have listed here. And he goes back to me and he says, John, it's 5 decibels above what's listed in the ordinance. And he goes over to PJ and he says, PJ, you violated the sound ordinance, you're 5 decibels over. And PJ says, no. No. What's the next step?
Again, I mean, I would, just like Dee said, at that point, we assume that it's going to be handled just like it would if it was a tape measure. You took a calculated measurement of something.
Okay.
I mean, if,
Okay. Well, let me just take you one step further. Okay. We can't come to a resolution. So PJ says, I'm taking you to court. Okay? And we march up there. Now Frank marches up to the court and he says, well, I took this thing with my phone, or I took this thing that I got from Mike Troyan, and that's my evidence. And what do you think the judge is going to say?
I would advise Frank not to take his phone. I mean, there's two things that if we're worried about that being the second way to handle this is to pay an outside company. And they're not expensive. I mean, it depends what you consider expensive, but in normal business, I would say $1,500. You can have a professional company come out that's certified with equipment, take care of and take that measurement. Now, from what I know, this has yet to come up, so I don't see it becoming, a 5 times a year you're going to be shelling out this to have a company come in. But the other way is to remove Frank and have somebody else do the measurement with certified equipment that can come in, and then I would make the argument. If the judge wants to challenge their background on that company usually stands by their work, almost like, a cop, you get a speeding ticket. They're calibrated, they're set up the equipment, and everybody accepts that.
The key is having a competent individual that can take the measurements and also be able to interpret the measurements. And again, we have to remember, this isn't neighbor to neighbor in a residential area. This thing has been developed and looking at where businesses are bordering residential areas. So,
Well, I understand that, but that makes it much, that tells my point even further. This business, yeah, they hire somebody, then, drop a bucket, they can go out and find the best sound guy on this side of the Mississippi. But how does this still help Frank? How does this help Frank solve this if there is a problem? How does this help him?
well, again, we have to first use common sense.
That's what I'm trying to use common sense.
And what ends up happening normally in my neighborhood, if there's a noise, they call the sheriff.
Right.
And then the sheriff makes a determination of is this a nuisance or not, or tries to get people to solve it. If not,
Well,
then
the
it
sheriff
would go
can't
to the
use
next.
this. He can't use this.
Well, he can enforce it as
How?
a ordinance.
Enforce that. If it was the ordinance,
Yes,
which
if it
is,
was the ordinance.
which is, that's in a different section of the revised code, that's not pertaining to zoning, but that was referenced by letters from Planning Director Dave Dietrich and Assistant Prosecutor in their letters, that there is another mechanism to enforce noise regulations as a nuisance.
Right.
And that would be
Other
enforced,
than-
that would be enforced by the
Right.
sheriff.
If
And that
we
would
had
be
a
enforced by the
nuisance
sheriff.
ordinance.
And that's kind of where I'm amongst other things here, one of which is the cost of enforcement. Nowhere am I seeing anything that's reasonableness for the district, such as, I got a loud lawnmower, it's a 1972. I don't have any neighbors immediate, but if I did,
But this isn't residential to residential.
Residential.
This is to have like a stamping mill next to your house. Some guy comes in and says that I'm going to be a lawn service, but he decides to have a side business, and he's stamping metal out there. But under our zoning, we allowed it into that mixed-use district, but all of a sudden, he decides to expand as a factory in possibly an area that's not zoned for that type of use. Maybe the zoning board of appeals said, okay, for this one limited instance, you can do that for a while. But if you want to protect, the general peace in the area, you have to have some type of measurement and some limit of what people have or can do under that approved use. And that's where it gets tricky right now, because, I moved here for the peace and the quiet, for the country lifestyle. But I also bought a bigger piece of property, so I didn't have to see a lot of people. However, sometimes people don't have that ability to move to where they can escape from noise and things like that. And a big business or a business moves next door to you. Then what do you do, right? So you need to have some sort of way to measure and a criteria where the common person can go and make a complaint that it's noisy.
So I think the one thing to remember too is this was passed recently as a peak.
Yeah. It's the same piece that you did have, just we had averages.
So we tried to make it actually to
Flexible.
a point that
Yeah.
was, and again, I think the driving thing was expectation by the residents of, and then the second thing is as a business moves in or under operation and what they should expect.
It's the same thing that we have had.
Yeah, I'm not saying what we had to have was acceptable either.
Well,
We're talking about a new resolution here, and I just want to, Frank,
But
if I call you, what's going to happen?
Well, I have to go out and, either one or two things, you're gonna have to buy me the equipment, make sure I'm trained properly, and then I'm gonna have to go and make the initial visits and make the initial measurements. My problem, part of my issue is, and I've discussed this with several people, including Mr. Dietrich, East Washington Street, freeway, there's 45, 50 decibels continuously, with nobody running anything, just the noise from the freeway and the cars going down the road. So here comes this poor business, and you're going to say to this business, you can't do more than 10 decibels? Because you're in violation now? Because you're over the 65 decibel limit?
No, but
That's not fair. That's
average, sir.
Yeah, but even in an average, that's not fair to that business. This business district has been here since we created zoning. Since 1948, the business district that you guys are most concerned about, from what I understand, is the business district along East Washington Street, from Messenger Road to 44. It's the biggest, seems to be the biggest concern. You got to remember, that's always been a business district since 1948. But I know that you can't mow your grass, you can't blow your leaves, you can't do any of that.
So I think there's
And let me finish. In all the years I've been zoning inspector, I've only had 3 noise complaints, and it's almost 40 years. And 2 of those 3 complaints were for a party on Auburn Road, and the prosecuting attorney says there's nothing you can do except send the sheriff to ask him whether you have a decibel scale or not. There's nothing you can do in a party situation because it's a one-time thing and it's gone.
And that's where that average
Right,
calculation
I understand
would
that. I'm not against the average. What I'm concerned about is, and I think 65 is too low. And I know people will say no, but I think it's because,
But this would be a constant 65. Now
Right, I
it's
know.
stopped.
No,
That's what that average would be. Or it'd be above that. 8 hours.
So you would need Frank to be out there for 8
well,
hours.
somebody.
No,
has to
you
do
would
that.
put a monitoring device there that you could download the readings, and then, especially if you're a competent person, you could read it and interpret it, and that's recorded. And if it's calibrated in the court of law, that expert witness would be able to testify on it based upon that equipment.
So, and just so you know, I mean, it's a handheld device, you calibrate it right before you set it up, and there's a device that goes along with it, you put on there and it calibrates. So it's not a very complicated thing, you make a few, it makes its own self-measurement, so it's almost like self-calibrating. You go through a procedure, it calibrates, you set it up, it records over time. And again, you can change the rate, there's a lot that can get into that. So yeah, there is a set of work that goes along with that, and there's a procedure that would have to be followed to get that. And again, the other option is you'll hire a third party. We talked about 3 complaints in 40 years. There's no reason to think that that starts to change. We're actually trying to improve what we had from before, not trying to set a lower limit. That was
Right,
accepted before.
I understand.
Again, if there's discussions that need to be about the limits, that is different, but we felt,
I think one of the concepts, at least, you know, as I listen to the bannering here, again, a reasonableness standard isn't overly quantifiable. However, the person who's on the other side of that fence, who's going to make the complaint, he isn't going to have a dB meter. He's going to have his ears. And he's going to say, you know what? That's too loud. I'm complaining. Okay? And at that point in time, at least I'm guessing historically, Frank would intervene without saying anything about decibels. You know what you're doing here is too loud. Can you see what you can do about quieting it down? Now, you know, eventually you may get to the point where the person is going to say, no, I'm going to continue to do this, and I don't care what you do. But people generally, if they're making noise and you call them on it, they'll try to mitigate it. So I think, at least what I've seen going on here is, we realize that, yeah, we had the other one and now we're getting a little more technical. Maybe we want to start out with something along the lines of just a reasonableness standard that Frank could then implement without having to spend $1,500 for a group to come out and make these things, and maybe give that a shot from an operational standpoint. And if that doesn't work, maybe we'd have to look at something else. But I think, you know, I don't want to put any words in anybody's mouth here. I was just kind of trying to paraphrase a little bit what I'm hearing.
I think one issue is that, you know, this would be the last recourse. It's not the first
step.
recourse.
It's the
You know,
last step.
And it was set up in the original ordinance that if, depending upon the circumstances, the trustees could authorize the hiring of a company like this. If it got to the point where, you know, you had a lot of people coming over here complaining, neighbors against businesses that butt next to each other, that they couldn't solve it on their own. There are a lot of techniques. I mean, some of the berms and the vegetation regulations that we have for businesses right now are in some ways to prevent unsightliness and also to absorb the noise of, you know, the operations over there. So these are some of the things that we can do when we are permitting these operations to come into place. You can have certain type of walls that mitigate the noise. You can have also, you know, the trees, placements of the trees and berms. And, you know, that would be the first course of action when you have and allow a business that could be noisy next to a residential area. But after the fact, this is where Frank could come in and propose before, you know, saying, look, you've had some noise complaints. I'd suggest you plant some trees like this, put some berms up, maybe put a decorative wall that could reflect the noise away from that residential area. These are things that he could do, but still you have to have a number to say, okay, now could you spend some money and do this rather than stopping your business. We don't want a business to be stopped in the community. We need the tax money, or we need also jobs in this area. But we have to make sure that people can live side by side together. And that's the key point of this type of noise ordinance. It's flexible enough where you can have people working, producing things, doing things, but within normal hours where other people can enjoy the quietness, sleep, rest. And again, it's for businesses next to residential areas. You know, if you have issues with your neighbors next door, that's something different. But this is that balance between business and people that have moved out here to be quiet.
I think one more thing to consider is we spent a lot of time discussing alternative wordings that could be used and removing. And what we kept coming back to is, what does a resident expect when they move into that area next to a business? Or what does a business expect when they move into an area? Now, you're right. If something's already there, it's just like two houses. Something's already right, we change the zoning, we have something. But as people come into the area, as things change and somebody buys a property, how do they know what to expect? And you can say it's going to be quiet, or we should be not have overly loud neighbors, but it gets into this wordiness, and no one knows what to expect from that. I'm fortunate to be an engineer. I spend a lot of time with words of what expectations are. We all do it, right? We buy, consume things, and we get a product, and we said, oh, it said this is what I expect. And when you have nothing to reference, you lose that. And that's why every time we went to a wording approach and pulled it out of noise and just tried to be very general, it got back into, if I'm moving, or if I have it selling, or even trying to put a business, what do I know I'm going to do? When do I know Frank's going to come over and say, that's too loud, do all this other work around there? And we kept saying, we're not sure. It's his discretion now. He thinks it's too loud, or the neighbor did. So this gave us a good sounding. Again, the numbers were accepted before as a peak, so people felt comfortable with what those were. You can say, hey, those were wrong. I'm not sure why they were accepted in the past then, but we felt that in changing it to an average then gave people that stableness that they wanted of how to conduct both business and feel comfortable as a resident, that you weren't going to have somebody metal stamping all night long and feeling like, hey, I can't live there anymore.
Right, now, without addressing the possibility of a stamping plant getting a variance to move into a residential neighborhood.
No, not a residential
Okay.
neighborhood. These are areas, you've got zones here adjacent to it. I mean, right now, we've got areas that are mixed use.
There is, and as we've talked about before, these decibel meter apps for your phone are kind of widespread now. One thing that I did, and I do take the comments from the county planning commission staff seriously, enforcement and reasonableness. Would the township board of trustees, the way this is written, I believe, or even maybe the zoning inspector, be subject to a mandamus action? Should a neighbor sit there all afternoon in his lawn chair at the property line and come up with 72 decibels behind a factory for 8 hours behind a factory on one road? Would we be subject to a mandamus action if we, as a board, consider that to be reasonable, but it's written in these solid numbers? Would we be mandated to hire that trained Frank, buy the equipment, or hire the technician to oversee that? I don't know. I don't know. That's something that I absolutely would need to follow up on, since it's written so solidly in those solid numbers, and doesn't just include terms such as reasonableness and
But again,
appropriate to the district.
Right, but reasonableness and appropriateness. A lawyer can also look at what is the definition of reasonable. what is the definition of appropriate? We've all seen lawsuits on that drag through the courts too. So we have to be very, very careful to protect the best interests of the township, the residents of the township, the businesses in the township. And this was the work that we did over the course of the year to try to find that balance, because we are growing as a township. A lot of things are moving this direction. And if you don't anticipate these things ahead of time, when it comes, it may be too late.
Okay, I'm anticipating this nosy neighbor that has a vendetta versus
No,
whoever.
no, but
is there.
it's not a neighbor, but it's like a business adjacent
Right.
to a residential
Well, neighbor to
area.
that business, okay, we all have some tie to the community, so I guess I'm using the term neighbor loosely. But
So
I really,
Doesn't do anything.
you see a lot of different ways.
Under
that-
agricultural.
You see a lot of different ways the regulations can be used as, for lack of a better term, a club to beat your neighbor over the head with, that you don't get along. And I going back to being mandated to pursue something that maybe is, shouldn't reasonably be pursued, but since it's written in such black and white terms, we have to.
Well, it's a last action.
It may not be.
If the neighbors cannot get along, or there aren't reasonable
But we're
parties in the
not,
discussion.
he's not talking about our last action. What he's talking about is, again, the vindictive neighbor takes his readings with his little phone. He says, this is what I've got. Are we then, because of what he did, going to be forced to take action on this because it's part of our zoning resolution?
I don't know.
And I believe that was your question.
Yes.
Are we going to be
That's the
forced
case.
into that? Are we at that point in time, even though we're not taking any action ourselves, are we now going to be forced to go to court, pull out that $1,500 piece of equipment? The expert witness is going to have to go to court to explain the operation of the equipment and the calibration. So it's just a kind of it's not so much, that we're going to get in trouble with it. Because, and I agree with the concept that, and it's no different than saying, okay, your lot setback is 65 feet. That's quantifiable. It's a number. It's something we have to go off of.
Correct.
Okay? So there's nothing unreasonable with what you guys are doing. Again, it comes into, let's call it implementation and ramification
Right.
of the document itself.
And again, the thing about it is, that person is not a competent person to measure. If they were, then you would have to take action. Were they trained? Do they know the calibration of their
But
device?
again, once they've brought it up, and they're bringing up the issue, as I said, do we now have to, okay, you said it was 72 decibels on your, and yes, I've got one here, been monitoring the whole proceeding. Is the fact that they brought it up sufficient for us to have to take action?
Again,
Or do we have to, hey,
they had
wait,
hired a person.
Well, no, I
that's
think it's the
competent
same
to do it.
thing as you brought up the setback. If somebody goes out and measures your neighbor's setback, how do you handle that?
I mean, you're not gonna move his house.
Well, no, I meant just if somebody does that, do you go out and say, fine, we have to go check it? Are they forcing your hand now to check that?
That's what they're asking right now.
Well, I know, but I'm asking in other instances
much, yeah.
regard this,
Yeah.
then I don't know why that wouldn't follow
Yeah.
suit, right? I'll be honest, just to be open, if that's how we handle complaints, if somebody says, hey, I went out and measured this and I think the setback is wrong, then why would this be different in my mind?
because we sending Frank out for 15 minutes with a tape measure is a lot cheaper than
Relocate the
get
lot
a
line.
$1,500 piece of equipment we gotta put on this guy's fence for 8 hours. Especially after the vindictive neighbor who's smart reaches over the fence and grabs it. And now we gotta pay for a piece of equipment which was stolen. Which they would, I'm not saying people around here would do that, but they're creative.
I think when you get into vindictive neighbors that want to cause problems, you're going to have problems.
This is true.
right? I mean, unreasonable, if we get into reasonable noise, when we brought it up, they hire a lawyer because they're vindictive and say, I think that's unreasonable noise, and their lawyer brings out whoever they need to file that as well. You're gonna have the same issue, right? I mean, this is where we struggled with particular language. Yes, you can make it real wordy and get into a lot of things, but you can have somebody argue the other side of that.
What gives me hope is that in the last 40 years, there's only been 3 or 4 complaints, and they're mainly parties, you know? And this is the thing, you know, we are a rural community. You will have those type of things occurring all the time. But now, as businesses start wanting to move into this area, you've got a large open areas of land. You've got an industrial park.
Well, that's where I think the main issue is gonna be. I think what we're gonna have to do here, gentlemen, since I don't see us reaching a real consensus right at the moment, and we do have, we've run a little bit late. I think we should extend this
Stand
hearing.
up and say, public input.
What's your feeling?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Public hearing.
just before we close on it. I mean, what am I supposed to do? I moved to Auburn about 5 years ago, and I butt up to East Washington, and behind me was a very quiet landscaper. About 3 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, a new company came in, and it's pretty much morning, noon, and night. You hear the backups of the trucks, you hear the diesel engines really loud. They have an intercom system. I could hear it in my bedroom with all the windows closed. I mean, I don't know what else you're supposed to do, because you guys are talking about enforcing or not enforcing, or Frank comes out and checks it with the meter. I mean, my option with me, my family, we've seriously been talking about moving because of a company that changed from what we expected when we moved there, because we were scouting this house for about 2 years. We visited it about 20 times. Never heard anything like that up until about 2.5 years ago. So, I mean, that's why I'm here. This is my first time coming to this, and it's definitely a big problem and issue for us.
Well, just to get a history, have you talked to the company owner?
Yeah, we have. I mean, doesn't seem like there's. I mean, friendly. I mean, he's helped us with a couple things, and we've talked to him, but they're just going to seem to run their business as usual. I mean, they say they mounded up some dirt behind our house. I can't tell if that really fixed anything, but it's just loud and it's constant.
Have you contacted anyone in the township?
I think we have. I mean, my wife and I don't know if we've talked over here, but we've called. I mean, we've definitely called. I don't know if it's been the sheriff or somebody, but it's. Let's see, probably about a year ago, we've probably made a few calls, and since it seemed like there wasn't a noise ordinance or there wasn't anything, we kind of just.
Oh, no, we've always,
we didn't.
the noise ordinance.
Right, but it
These
didn't seem like there was
zoning
anything.
commission's doing is modifying it.
Right, but it didn't seem like there was anything that we could have done, so we felt like we were just stuck.
And when you're
with
talking about,
what they
okay,
wanted to do.
so the intercom system,
It's loud, yes.
it's loud. How often does
Well, that's
it?
not going to average out over 8 hours, because it's.
Okay, in your opinion, based on what you've heard
Say
here.
a couple times a day, a couple times an hour, you'll hear that
Okay.
intercom.
So based on what you've heard here,
Yeah.
would this zoning amendment, do you think, with all the averages and everything else, would they fall within the guidelines of that?
To me, I don't
Again,
think
if
so,
it's a diesel
no.
truck
I
starting
don't
up
think, I
and
don't think
leaving,
so. Well, it's not
and they're
just
gone in
leaving.
3
They're,
minutes,
they're around for an hour or two in the morning, hour and two.
I think some of their bigger problems is
And they have-
backup alarms.
Well, they have
required by law.
it's the backup alarms, and then, they pressure wash all their machines, their trucks when they get back. It could be 7, 8, or 9 o'clock at night. They worked on, I forget what holidays, but all the holidays. They work on Sundays. I mean, there's really no break.
so we have no way to tell without spending $1,500 at his property line whether or not they would fall under the guidelines of the new.
It appears they would, but
proposed
my ear
amendment.
can't measure it. So I mean,
Or the
yeah.
complainant could spend that $1,500, show that he's got a case, and then we can act upon it.
Well, again, I think that we there's always the civil courts. If somebody goes out there, this is used as a measurement, but if somebody goes out there, Frank can talk to it and say, hey, it does seem, we're not measuring yet, we will take that step, because if you're in violation, then they're forced,
Noise is
you're
one
gonna
thing.
force their hand, right? If somebody's in violation now you have the means, you can try to work with them. Maybe it's different than a neighbor versus Frank trying to work with them. I did bring this up, and this is just, I wanted to show this just because it's an interesting thing. I work in a facility that we have a factory in back. It's not like a massive stamping or anything like this, but these lines actually measure what was measured as the noise during that time. This is during work hours at different locations. And they actually started firing up different things at different times to try to get that value. So when we're talking about levels, you have to understand that, the increase is in dB, so we're not talking like, going from 60 to 65 is just like, a normal 5, right? It's much more. So these are sitting around 70, something like that, and that's in a working factory environment, that kind of stuff. So, I think the question came up about is the right levels. I mean, that's why the levels are set low for the nighttime area, because we expect people to want to have quiet and sleep. And you're right, if you go right next to the freeway and you measure and a car comes zooming by, you're going to get a high level coming through there. There is general background noise and stuff like that. But,
Okay, I'm going to go back to my original question to my colleagues. No offense to you. We're not reaching a consensus right now, I don't believe. So I would like to make a motion that we continue this hearing. And I'm not sure what the date we need to pick is, but clearly there's this, you guys have put an awful lot of research into this thing, and this is a very difficult, in my mind, issue to tackle. Is it unnecessary completely? Well, not to this gentleman. It's very important to him. So I think in the light of this, we're going to have to we've heard your thoughts, and we may need to have some more thoughts from you gentlemen, but I think we need to, my motion stands to continue the hearing till,
I'll second.
I can't see that far, so.
Well, we meet one
Somebody
more
wants to
time.
peek over there.
The 19th would be our next meeting.
I don't think that's enough time, gentlemen.
Organizational, we're going to discuss later. Looks like maybe the 3rd.
How about if we go is that the
16th of January.
You can see I need to visit, and I did just visit.
Yeah, I don't have my notes yet either. So
I'm about 500 feet from the sign.
maybe 16th of January.
How does that sound? Is that any, could you gentlemen be available, or somebody from the commission at least?
And that would be good, and I just want to add that it's a public hearing. We only didn't take much public comment on this tonight besides
Well, it
yours.
will
And
obviously
we will,
take
it'll be
more
wide
public
open for public
and,
comment. We wanted to
but
get the background
I think what we'll do
first.
is we're going to schedule more time for this.
So can I ask, what other information would help the next public hearing? What can we provide to this I mean, we can state things again, that's fine, but is there additional information you guys would like that we could help?
Sure, I can tell you a couple things right now. That 8-hour average.
Wait a minute here. Back up.
Sorry.
Okay, you
I
made
got
your
a motion on
You
the
did.
floor.
I'm sorry.
You did.
Anybody,
I'll
I
talk to
don't
you.
think you
Okay.
guys are
Yeah,
paying
sorry.
any attention to me.
Right.
We will continue this conversation in about a month.
I'll be happy to talk to you.
Mike.
Get something, yeah.
Yes.
What's the date there?
Yes.
John?
Yes. Well, there-
Time? We gotta set a time?
We needed to set a time, gentlemen. So the time will be, I think you need to allow more than half an hour again.
6:30.
6:30?
So if you allow an hour, we'll make it at 6:30. So that'll be my next motion, we make it at 6:30.
Mike? Yes. TJ?
Yes.
John?
Yes. Okay, I want to thank the zoning commission members for coming, and it's very helpful to have you here. We're not just reading the text, now we're hearing what your thoughts were, and I think everybody in this room can understand that you put an awful lot of, not only thought, but factual information behind what we have here, and I'm very pleased with that, I have to I think I'm speaking for my colleagues as well.
Now, John, one question I have for you. Is it your duty then to either modify or approve or deny, right?
Nothing yet.
Those are our
Right.
options, but first we have to come to a conclusion of the hearing.
Okay, so as far as the zoning commission doing anything, it's really in your hands right now, right?
Well, yeah, I think that's a pretty safe thing. I'm sure you may hear from some of the board members if they're in their contemplation to think, because we're not going to just forget about this for a month. We're going to think about it. And, but I think it's important that, you know, we had a zoning issue. We've pointed out several times, well, this is what it was. What we had didn't work. I mean, the issue really, I say it didn't work. It was very subjective. I couldn't send Mr. Kitco to a court and win on that. So I'm very pleased that you're trying to hone something down that we can win on, and we can solve this gentleman's problem. But the problem does, you know, here he is, right here. It exists. The problem does exist, and we got to come up with something that's going to meet both parties. As you said earlier, we're not going to try to drive the Party B out of here either. And whatever we come up with has to be reasonable. Yeah. So, okay, with that, we're going to just go right into